a template or a framework, a set of methodological things that you need to think about if you're interested in doing a deliberation experiment, and a kind of a template for how to do one well. So our idea is that if people actually read this paper and find it interesting, that it might help to kind of provide that template for those who are interested in the empirical study of deliberative democracy and help to further this empirical turn in the literature on deliberative democracy. So that's what I got.
Maybe thanks to expand this to maybe another field, such as just economy in general.
I'm so glad you asked, because I also forgot to mention that this same group, America Speaks, has contacted. They really like Archon Fong, this very, very fancy professor at Harvard, and fortunately Archon likes Teku and I. But they've contacted us, our group, about helping them with the design of their next big one, which is coming up in June, and they're going to have a very similar thing, a similar scale, but it'll be national instead of just California, and it's going to be debates over America's fiscal future. So you'll probably hear about this. I think it's going to be a really big media, like CNN is going to report it sort of thing, and they've asked us to help them this time to design, because they do care about sort of do their sessions matter for people, and do they matter for policymakers, and so they've asked us to help them design it. And in fact, we've had several phone calls with them that have been a little bit contentious, because there are things that we tell them, like you need to use random assignment and stuff like that, that they don't want to hear because it makes it harder for them. But they also recognize that when we talk to them about it, how important it is to do this stuff. But so we're going to try to replicate this for sort of nationally with this fiscal futures problem. Jim?
Yeah, I was also wondering if you thought about other dimensions that might be relevant in the deliberative process. So, the social psychology literature, other characteristics such as gender and race certainly also influence how people perceive the quality of discussion. It seems like, that you would have some of that information with this data.
Yes, yeah, Archon brought this up recently. So this was just our first paper, and in fact, I basically just did this because I wanted to set out the methods for those guys. But he pointed out that that's equally true, that at these tables there's different mixes of gender, race, and we have all of that as well. And it would be very interesting. I mean, it's hard to think about why, say, gender might matter for people's views on healthcare, although perhaps for some dimensions it might.
Yeah, some of the process and quality questions certainly.
Yeah,
and for healthcare opinions, we do know there are some gender differences.
Right.
And some of those, there might be less error associated with the pre-treatment measures. But
for
your methodological points, then it might.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I know there's some people look at, say, gender, for these small group exercises, that sort of going from 0 to 1 makes a big difference. And so we can study stuff like that. The other thing we do know is whether people had health insurance, because that was one of the survey questions. And so that might be, instead of gender or the usual demographics, that might be a more salient one for these questions too.
Yeah, somewhat related to that question. Like, for instance, I was wondering if this model will work in a completely different setting. Because anthropologists have pointed out, ethnographers have pointed out that people make evaluation as they express themselves of others. And what deliberative democratical theories have been critiqued about, that it doesn't take into consideration the asymmetry in power relationship in a society. So many of these ideas would probably work out in a setting where you have a level playing field. But in a completely hierarchical situation, I'm thinking about, say, village meetings in extremely impoverished countries of the third world, where you have some people with enormous power and some people without any power at all, people who are powerless, wouldn't open up at all or show their differences or disagreement, just because of the inbuilt power asymmetry.
Yeah, and you worry about that even in this setting, because maybe people have different education levels, and perhaps there's the college educated. I mean, this is a real cross section, and so maybe the college educated people at the table did all of the talking, and those who weren't did less of it. So we would worry about that, and that's sort of maybe along the lines, like you said, along what Jen was saying, that we could actually test for that. You'd have to make sure that their assignment procedure didn't matter for education level the way it doesn't matter for disagreement. But in any case, to some extent, we could test for that and look into it. I think it's a great idea. The other side to the coin is I mean, this is speaking outside of this study, but there's another possibility that having these kind of deliberative exercises might sort of get people who otherwise would be voiceless in the process to have a chance to speak. And I just know from another study that I'm finishing up that that we did some, unrelated to this, but we did some deliberative sessions involving members of the U.S. Congress, and the mix of people who showed up at our setting. So when you do an experiment, you think about people not showing up as kind of a nuisance, but in this case, it's substantively interesting to know who showed up and who didn't. And it turned out the kind of demographics of the people who show up at deliberative sessions is very different from the kind that get involved by voting and making campaign contributions and joining interest groups or voluntary work and those sorts of things. So you can actually, we'd want to look at sort of to what extent does deliberation kind of suppress voices, but in other ways it kind of brings out voices that might not have been heard. So.
Did you say your next session was going to be on fiscal issues?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that sounds fascinating. I think for that you might want to think more whether there would be multiple dimensions that are relevant, because you've had such a turnaround between Republicans and Democrats over the last few decades over whether they worry about budget deficits and under what conditions, so that might get in. There's also for that one that might be neat to try to get questions on is the time dimension, because
I'm sorry, the what?
The time dimension.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Involved, because in the big Keynesians say now you should be running a big deficit, but then it shouldn't be too big in the future.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the Republicans are saying don't run it right now.
Right.
And that's actually a somewhat different issue from the more traditional one, whereas traditionally conservatives didn't worry about the budget deficit unless a Republican is in the office, and then they don't worry about it. So the politics.
Practically speaking, yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. Obviously they're only going to do it one time because it's just an enormous effort. That they're talking about 3,000 people all across at 5 sites across America, and it would be fascinating to get an over time view of, especially something like fiscal future that I think a lot of citizens really pay close attention to. And in some sense, I'm guessing that a lot of people hadn't really thought about the kind of policy dimensions for health care financing, other than to the extent that they themselves have some ideological component to them. I wish we could. But we'll at least have it. At least they're running it in June of this year. It's probably still going to be in the sort of the pro-Keynesian part of the cycle where the argument's still compelling. So, yeah.
I just wanted to ask. I mean, we don't have the paper, but I think I'm just wondering if in the paper you compare the methodological approach you're showing with if you did the more standard factor analysis, because obviously that would be a great strength of the.
Yeah, I don't in the paper, but I've done it. The Stata version, the exact version I described in the Stata, and what you actually get, it's a little bit counterintuitive in the way that I presented it, but you actually get less. You get the same non-linear shape based on the point estimates of what Stata tells you, but the point estimates are less precise if you don't use this kind of a model. And so what this model does is it makes correct use of uncertainty within the model, but it also has a tremendous amount of power, because if you think about that figure that I showed where all the variables are listed, that you're using a ton of data to estimate what boils down to just 4 point estimates. And so these models are more powerful, but they're also sort of normatively correct in that they're, so you actually, but we do get that. It just, if you do the kind of factor analysis and creating variables and data, you do get that nonlinear effect, but